The cycle of history repeats itself, much to the dark god's merriment. We approach the hour of the last phoenix, when only Asuryan's fading power can save us from thirsting Cain. The fate of the elves now relies upon two realms, one doomed to perish in fire and slaughter, and one that shall endure, whilst I have strength to defend it. Mortals shall assume divine roles. The heirs of Anarion will fight the final battle, and the accursed Widowmaker shall be freed from its prison of stone. These are the end times.
Hey, good day and good evening to all the fellow YouTube viewers out there as we return to our seats in the den once again for a philosopher's examination of the end times. Now we have moved on through the first two volumes and into the third, the end times of Kane. And I must say that this to me is a triumph in writing and storytelling. It encompasses such a vastness and such a rich history of elves, including their pantheon of gods, great cataclysmic events, heroic deeds beyond compare, as well as great falls of heroes down into the wells of oblivion. So, welcome to my two philosophers, Keith and Vince. Please say a quick word if you want to, or elaborate on your broader thoughts of Kane as a whole, if you'd like.
Absolutely. Good evening, everybody. Glad to be here again. I agree with all of your sentiment on Kane. I think this is definitely, it is some of the best storytelling that we've encountered so far. And it is very, shall we say, dramatic in its telling. Brother against brother, friends become enemies, and enemies become friends, all of that sort of thing. All your classic Shakespearean elements at play here.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone. Good to be back. Yeah, just to echo what you two guys have already said, I think Kane is definitely one of my favorite books out of the End Time series. It's a real page-turner. I found that you get into it, and as you'll see, these chapters are pretty hefty, but it's very easy to read, and definitely quality work.
Yeah, this one is full of true drama. This is the one piece that I think we could make a film out of this one. I think it's the easiest piece of work that you could make a film out of.
Yeah, I would watch that film.
Good. Okay, so just some opening thoughts about this one. There's a one-page facade here where we have to hearken our thoughts back to Nagash just for a moment, to the Oak of Ages, where Ariel was struggling and the Oak of Ages was dying. And if you remember back to that, it was Alariel that came to the rescue of that. She came to Athaloran to plead for aid, to get help in chasing down Manfred, who captured her daughter. Now, this little sequence here at the opening reveals that Liliath, who is one of the elven gods in the Pantheon, is having a bit of an exchange with Ariel. And in this exchange, Ariel blames Liliath for putting her in this position, for allowing her to be corrupted, and the disease, and also, and it's a very obscure thing in many ways, she expresses to Liliath that Liliath is playing around with the sequence of time a little bit, and also messing around with the nature of things a little bit too much. Unapologetically, though, Liliath just says, yeah, well, that's your fate, and things need to move on. The Ranadandra is approaching, and we need to prepare ourselves. Being a bit involved in elf lore, as I play a couple of elf armies, but I know that you do as well, Keith. You play a wood elf army. Do you recall coming across this Ranadandra in your prior readings? and what that all means in the elf world?
I believe it is. It's their word for the end times, and it's something kind of that Lilius has alludes to quite a bit. That this is all happen again. This is all cyclical. It's essentially the ending of the war of the gods, the elven gods, that has happened and will happen again, and so on into eternity.
Yeah, and you're very right. It is important to note that it's a cyclical sort of a thing for the elves. They had a great war of the gods eons ago, before Ulthuan itself was established even. And we'll allude to a little bit more of that as we go through the story, because there is a lot of tie-in with the elven pantheon of gods as we go through this. So that'll become important. Good. Well, maybe Vince, we'll turn it to you initially and let us know, because we're going to turn our faces to Ulthuan directly for most of this. But we have to sort of set the stage and the timing as to what's going on in Ulthuan when we pick up this story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the first keys is you got to look at the timing here. So when we start out, it's winter 25-24. And, you know, it's really interesting, if you, just as we mentioned with the previous books, these books aren't happening back to back, right? It's not as though Cain picks up where Glotkin left off or something like that. Instead, there's overlap between them. And if you go and look at the timing, you can see here that that's the case here too. So when we open what's going on, it has a brief overview of the rest of the world, and we see what's happening on Ulthuan as things are going down in the rest of the world. So we start pre-resurrection of Nagash, right? And we have all these various peoples off island because they're over trying to rescue the Everqueen's daughter, who is still alive at this point we begin our story, because Nagash has not been raised yet at the Nine Demons. And so we're missing some of our elvish leadership, and at the same time, Tyrion is very, obsessed with this still and not knowing her fate, and so on and so forth. And most presently threatening is not anything to do with the most presently threatening Ulthuan. Actually, has nothing to do with the Dark Elves in the larger story. It's more of just a preamble, and that is that the demonic forces are overwhelming Ulthuan, sort of en masse. And the 10 kingdoms, because Ulthuan is divided into these 10 legendary kingdoms, the 10 kingdoms are basically sort of in chaos and not really uniting to fight back, and because each one has its own king or prince, and so they're all kind of doing their own thing, and they're basically losing. And Finubar, the the Sea Master or whatever, the Phoenix King, as it were.
The Phoenix King, yeah.
Yes. He is sort of like this. He's a recluse, and he's not coming out. He's not talking to anyone. Some people even think he's dead. Basically, the last person to have talked to him is Teclis, and he's not leading his people. And so what we remember from our sort of very brief vignette way back at the beginning is that Teclis, sort of talks to Tyrion, and they have a conversation, and basically Tyrion just says, you know what, this is what I'm going to do. You're right, I've got to leave. I got to not worry about my daughter. His illegitimate daughter is not really supposed to be his. It's supposed to be Finubar's. And I'm going to lead people despite, the fact that he really doesn't have the legitimate authority to unite all 10 kingdoms beneath him. But he has the will, if not the right. And he does, and almost gets all of them, with one notable exception, which is Prince Imric, the Lord of Calador. And obviously being where the dragon princes, and basically where all the dragons are from. And Imric basically says, you know what, do what you will, I'm going to cede my own lands. He goes off and just takes to his own, and then Tyrion starts just a tear around Ulthuan, just sort of circling the island, just, a demon possessed, as it were. Just literally, ironically, killing a bunch of other demons.
I was going to say that's an ironic description of Tyrion.
Yes.
With the role that he's doing.
For two different reasons, yes, that will come up in this book, both in what he's fighting and his eventual fate.
Yeah. As a side, really quickly, I just want to point out that Imric's stance on that was that he, like many, had lost faith in Finubar because he just was a recluse, and he was hidden away for months and months and months at a time of great need. So he was really pressing for Finubar to be denounced and then to establish a new Phoenix King to replace him. And Imric wanted to be that guy. Tyrion being really his only possible rival, and it was all of the Phoenix Guard themselves that got behind Tyrion that really kind of swayed that in his favor and put an end to that argument. And you kind of got the feeling that Imric went away a little bit pouty in the fact that he lost out in that contest of wills.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very much like a fine, I'm going to take my ball and go home thing, right? Yeah. Which of course sets up a lot of things that are going to come about later, this whole chain of events. But I think it gets to the Ramadan and the cyclical nature of this, and that there's a couple sidebar conversations we're going to come to where these steps are like, it's sort of just all happening because everybody has, there's always a part to play. There's like a betrayer and a this and a that, and everyone is going to play these parts. That is, it's not like, it is not as much a predetermined fate, like you are destined to be this guy. It is that this role, the betrayer, the conqueror, these roles exist in the Ramadan every time. Who they are is sort of yet to be determined, but they will exist. And so it's sort of setting all that up.
Okay. Well, maybe Keith, let's turn to you and you can take us through Tyrion's initial campaign as he tries to restore some order to Ulthuan.
Yeah. So Tyrion is roaming across Ulthuan, undertaking what's known as the Wars of Reclamation, and he's essentially just trying to rid Ulthuan of all the demon threat. And a couple of significant things happen as he's doing it. At one point, he's fighting in a rift to the realm of chaos. At another point, he's trying to free the White Tower of Hoeth from a demon incursion, and he gets struck by a soul grinder, which hurts him quite badly, and he becomes infected. Presumably, it's the soul grinder of Nurgle, and he becomes a little bit infected. But he keeps pushing. He's undaunted by this, and he refuses to sit and let himself heal. So he's eventually fighting a large group of demons who are laying siege to Hoeth. And he comes across a foe known as Enkari, which is a keeper of secrets. Tyrion in the past, and I'm not actually too familiar with that sequence of events, so maybe Tyrion, you could comment, you know, who Enkari is and what his relationship was with Teclis, or Tyrion?
Well, actually not directly with those two, but he was a demon that manifested to face off against the Narian back in the early days. So that's, for those of you that are unfamiliar, that's Tyrion and Teclis' daddy is an Narian.
Papa Elf.
Yeah, his elf daddy.
Yeah. So Tyrion is fighting up against Enkari, but he's quite weakened. One of the kind of interesting things here is Corhil comes to save the day, cuts off one of Enkari's arms, and basically is able to get Tyrion out of there. What's interesting about that is traditionally Corhil is head of Finubar's personal guard. So we start seeing now that Corhil has taken over a more active role and is beginning to accept Tyrion as regent of Ulthuan and possibly the next Phoenix King. But they go on, and Enkari sets up his stronghold in a place called Moonspire, which is a shrine dedicated to Lilia. So Tyrion takes some time to get a little bit better before trying to take on Enkari again, and then his brother Teclis shows up. Now, up until this point, Tyrion has pretty much been running the show by himself. Teclis is off doing things with Lilia. The Everqueen has disappeared. We don't know where she is. Finubar is holed up in his rooms. But Teclis shows up to help out his brother and just starts raining comets and fire all over the demons. And he realizes that the Moon Shrine, because it's a sacred place of Lilia, and Lilia is Teclis' patron, that he can, in one fell swoop, just completely banish all of the demons from Ulthuan. But if he can just get rid of Enkari, because that guy is kind of like a locus and a focal point for the demon incursion. So to cut a long story short, Tyrion lops off Enkari's head. Teclis grabs the head, runs up the top of the shrine, bangs his staff down on the head of Enkari, and vanishes. Sends this blinding white light all across Ulthuan that dissipates just a couple miles offshore and just banishes all of the demons on Ulthuan. But in the process, he breaks his moon staff and then is racked by his terrible pains that he got from birth, and only the magic of Lilius was able to keep it at bay. And so Ulthuan was relieved of the demon incursion.
Yeah. So this gets rid of all the demons, effectively, right over the whole island, right? Just
pretty much.
Whole sweeping shot.
Yeah, it was like, the end of every action movie over the past, 10 years, where when you just kill one big bad guy at the end, all the rest go away. It's just like, that's what happens. It's just, boom, they all collapse.
Is that how it always works in real life?
Apparently, that's how it works.
Well, that's how it ended in Glocken.
That's how it ended in Lord of the Rings. You drop the ring in the hole, and all his world falls apart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whether it's Avengers or Joss Whedon or Tolkien, it's all the same thing.
Yeah, I learned that when I was 11. Good. Okay, well, that's a big relief for all the High Elves, obviously, to know that that's happening. But then we have another interesting exchange here, and we sort of, with this, kind of learn about the plots of Teclis. Teclis himself gets called by Imric to come to Calador. Now remember that Imric kind of tucked himself away and ran away from the rest of elf society and declared himself, not part of the other 9 anymore. So it's a little bit curious that he calls upon Teclis to come here, because he's sort of the lore master and the wisdom of all of Ulthuan at this point. Anyway, in a bit of an exchange, they talk about how Imric had dreams where he was presented with visions of his ancestor, Calador, Dragon Tamer, who was the creator of the Great Vortex in the center of Ulthuan that kept chaos at bay. Although Teclis doesn't reveal this to him, Teclis also has had communion with Calador himself as well. And I don't know how this works, because they don't really describe it in here, but I guess Teclis goes to visit the Great Vortex every once in a while, and it's sort of like talking through the pane glass to somebody else at a prison cell kind of thing, where you press your hands up against the window and talk to each other. I don't know how that goes, but Teclis has had some involvement with Dragon Tamer as well, so this totally seems believable. Anyway, the message from Calador himself is effectively to say that things are about to change, and you should embrace the future and leave the past beside. And the very next day, a one-man ship sails into Calador. It's a Nagarothi ship, though, and it's a dark elf who's in charge of that ship. So this seems very odd, but what they discover in the hold of this ship is hundreds and hundreds of dragon eggs, which Malekith and his minions have been raiding and stealing for centuries and centuries. And this is effectively the gift of alliance from Malekith to Imric and Calador. So this is the big first political move, I guess, that we see of these two old races getting involved with one another. When you guys read this, what's you have some quick thoughts on how you interpreted this going down? Believable? Not believable?
I think it was, I think it was a bit of a risk on the part of the Dark Elves. Like, I know it's taken just sort of narratively that the ship with one guy shows up, but every other time in this story a ship sets out on the ocean, there's like 82 other armies also out there on the ocean ready to attack and swarm any ship out there. This is one ship alone with one guy with like the wealth beyond calculation on it, and they're just like banking that no. Both nations, by the way, are under siege by the forces of chaos, who also have navies and ships and stuff. And like a sea monster, anything wrecks this ship, your whole plan goes to crap. And oh well, I guess no trick there, Malekith. I mean, it's really a long play. I would have sent a full crew. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I think the one thing that saved him here is it's a quick little snippet, but he says that the sails of the ship were actually bearing the sign of Liliath. So
Yeah.
maybe that's what got him under the radar. I don't know.
Sure.
Liliath is basically the eagles from Lord of the Rings in this book. If something inexplicable happens, then Liliath did it. That's why. A wizard did it, Liliath did it.
Nice. All right, I buy it.
Yeah.
She just shows up and problem solved.
Yeah, she's like Krell from the Gash. She's plot armor.
Very nice.
There you go.
But to comment on that, so to bring up Liliath, Liliath is the common link between Imric and Calidor. She's facilitating that whole communion, and she's also clearly Teclis's patron, so she's helping that out there. But I mean, if you want to get a whole province of dragon-riding princes on your side, there's no better way than showing up with a boat full of dragon eggs. So I totally buy into that.
Oh yeah, yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and here's where we see a lot of her.
Elves for dragon eggs.
Absolutely. Here's where we see a lot of her machinations coming to bear. I mean, not only was she talking at the beginning with Ariel, but she's really the face behind Bertonia and all this stuff. I mean, she is string puller extraordinaire, and we're finally getting a glimpse of why when she speaks or when she interacts throughout this book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's turn our attentions to the Dark Elves for a second then. So we, again, casting our thoughts back to the beginning of Nagash, where we did the whole round table of what's going on in the Warhammer world. It was Valkia the Bloody that had set forth from the north and came down raging upon Nagaroth, and at the time that we pick this up, again, she has ravaged 3 of the major elf cities and taken them over entirely. And she's in an eternal battle with Helbron in her city of Haggrafe, I think is that her town?
Harganeth.
Harganeth, thank you. And Helbron had sent out for help, but then she just realized, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit from this, of course, but she realized, oh, you know what? This is a pretty good time. You just get to go kill stuff all the time and bathe in blood of my friends and my enemies. So, you know what? I'm just going to hang out here and keep doing that because it's fun. And it's Kane-like. So obviously this is a gift from Kane for us to be perpetually fighting and bloodying ourselves. So let's get into it. Is her attitude about things. Not so with Malekith, who has been absent for a lot of this first salvo of attacks from Valkia. He's been off somewhere. He never explains himself to anybody because he's too important to explain himself to anybody. But he comes back to see his nation in this terrible state and on the verge of being overrun by chaos. So what he decides is that this was never his true home. It was his exiled home. He doesn't care about it enough anymore. So it's time to really just mount the final assault on Oathland, reclaim what is rightfully mine as the Phoenix King of the Elves, and effectively says, everybody on the boat. No, not asking, I'm telling. Everybody on the boat, we're going. But he has one last thing to do before he does that, and that is that he has to go and visit Mom, who is Marathi, for those that are unfamiliar with the family ties of the Elves. And she has declared herself, at this point, to be the mortal incarnate of Hecate, which is elf goddess of magics. So she's sitting in her hold, shrouding her stronghold in magic, so she's really not affected too much by chaos attacks, but she's not doing anything about it either. So Malekith sorts out a whole bunch of folks before he gets them on the boat and goes to visit her and bangs on the door and tells her the grand plan. She calls him out and says, "You're stupid. It's not going to happen. That thing is past. So, I mean, being a king is not good enough for a son like mine. You should be a god. and says all these kinds of things that are backhanded compliments, as is their relationship. But effectively says, no, you don't get my support. And if you're going to go and do that, then off you go. And then, so there he goes. Malekith is like, all right, well, I'll have to do it without you. But there's one little quick twist here that happens at the end, and that is that as Malekith is marching away from the stronghold, and he's doing his final gatherings to get on the boat and head to Ulthuan, this envoy of Morathi sort of presents herself at the gates and introduces herself as Drusilla, and expresses that as a small token, because you are Morathi's son, Morathi has granted you with this contingent of soldiers that will go alongside you to Ulthuan. Seeing through this a little bit, Malekith decides, well, obviously this is just so she can keep an eye on me, and once it's all safe for her, she'll probably come and show up, which is maybe not wrong, but there you go. So off he goes. With all of the Dark Elves, he effectively empties out the whole nation of remaining Dark Elves, gets them on a boat, and heads to Ulthuan. So, let me get your guys' thoughts on this Dark Elf situation.
Well, there are two little snippets from that whole. There's a lot of text there that I want to point out. The first one I think will be particularly interesting to you two Skaven lovers is that one of the cities, Kar falls. It could have withstood the Chaos Onslaught, but it falls because of an earthquake. And apparently the Skaven were seen around those parts, popping their furry little heads out. So I thought that was interesting, that maybe that was the first semblances of an alliance between Chaos and the Skaven, or maybe the Skaven were just messing with everyone. Mm-hmm. You guys remember that one?
I did catch that, yeah. It was like 2 sentences worth.
Yeah.
I recall.
I think they were just testing a weapon we'll see later used in Nuln.
Maybe.
Maybe.
The other little thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that when Morathi declares herself as Hecate incarnate, later on in that conversation, Malekith declares himself as the embodiment of Cain, which is quite interesting. And for the longest time, Malik has seen as the Scourge of Cain, and Cain on Earth.
Yeah, and maybe this is worth a moment to talk about the significance of Kane. Obviously, it's the title of the book, so it's got to have a big deal to do with it, right? Well, Kane is the elven god of, well, depending on how you look at things. If you're a dark elf, you call him the elven god of murder. If you're a high elf, you call him the elven god of war. Either way, he's still associated with a great deal of violence. Kane was effectively in the first initial Ramadan was the force of great destruction and was getting a little bit out of control. So it took efforts by the other elven gods to contain him. Otherwise, it would have just been the destruction of all the elves was the worry. So Kane has a shrine on the northern tip of Ulthuan and on the Blighted Isles, and therein is held the Widowmaker, which is the sword and the blade of Cain, which encompasses the embodiment and the nature of Cain, the god, and all the attitudes that we associate with him and his violent nature. So that's sitting there. It's guarded by Phoenix Guard, and it's remained untouched for thousands of years. There's been a couple of ploys in the past of elf history where Malekith has made a little bit of a play to get to the Blighted Isle so he can obtain that, and assuming that with the power granted by the Widowmaker, he could just wade through all of the elves in Ulthuan and slay whatever steps in his way to reclaim his throne. So he's always associated with that. He's and been part of his aim is to become that embodiment of Cain and to get that Widowmaker. So you can't help, if you know a little bit about elf history, to think that that's goal number one for Malekith at this point, is to get back to that stage. Okay. So, any other thoughts about that Dark Elf business, Vince, that you want to pipe in on?
The only thing I would say is it surprises me that Malekith isn't more suspicious of Drusilla and them showing up to help. Like he says openly that he doesn't trust him, and so he puts him at the front of the column as they're marching. But you know, like for somebody who's really as brilliant as Malekith is, you know, to just assume, oh, they're probably here to watch me until later, and not look any deeper into this or think any more of it, seems, you know, I really feel like he could have given that more thought.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly his mom, Morathi, has the history of being a manipulator, and he himself, Malekith, has always been a little bit more straightforward. That he kind of rules with fear and gets people to do things for him because otherwise he'll just murder them, right? So maybe not as subtle and elfish. Okay. So with all that laid out and the exodus of Nagroth, we're going to turn our attention back to Ulthuan, and maybe I'll pass it over to one of you guys to give us what becomes the Battle of Eagle Gate, and take it from there.
Sure, so I can pick up with this one. So yeah, we have the Battle of Eagle Gate, and one thing I will say about a battle is when you look at the section that arrays the troops, as we've mentioned many times before, there's always a winner as far as like a funny troop or something that's got a little interesting side note in it. But also, you can usually sort of pick the winner based on just like if you read who's participating, and on the top left, you recognize the names of one of the armies and you don't recognize the names of the other army, that's a sign that we've got a B team against an A team, and it's probably not going to go well for the B team. So, yes, I'm just saying, when we look at the High Elf forces here, they're not bringing the A game, whereas when you look over at the Dark Elves, you've got Malice, Darkblade, and Drusilla herself, which are, you know, obviously two very potent individuals. Malice.
Remember the name of the Eagle Gate commander?
Yvarn or Yvarn or something, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
His name was Muck. Right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Some guy we made up, and you know, who will now fight valiantly. But what I particularly like about this little explanation is there's two Hydras helping Malice Darkblade's assault, which is Grizzlefang and Snarlclaw. And the funny joke here is just the most ridiculous thing, that he is upset. Malice Darkblade is upset about when he bought these Hydras because he basically bought them too soon. Like, the price on them dropped a week after he bought them, and he now regrets his decision to purchase when he did because he spent too much money on his Hydras right before a war. Like, of all the just ridiculous, trivial things to be concerned with, it's like, man, I really feel like I overpaid for those Hydras.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very funny insight. Yeah.
Yeah, that's his problems.
Yeah, your entire nation is in flame, and you have no home, and you either win here or you die. But no, that's fine. Let's worry about a couple gold. So at any rate, yes, we have the slaughter at Eagle Gate, and basically what you've got is you've got a very thin line of elves trying to hold a beach against a dark elf assault. And the dark elves are relying a lot on Cold One Knights. Malice Darkblade is a Cold One writer. He writes a Cold One named Strife, I think, right? And Spite, sorry, thank you. I knew it was something like that. Yes, Spite. Some appropriately dark elfy name. And and they, you know, sort of like the commander looks out and he's like, well, we're screwed. Because he realizes they're outnumbered 10-1, you know, at an easy estimation. And they, the Cold Ones sort of charge in, and the elves give it their best. And then inexplicably, the Cold One Knights just break and run away. Like, that's the first assault. It fails, like, within minutes because the Cold One Knights just fail and break. And I found this to be a really weird passage, and I don't know, Keith, were you able to infer why this occurred? Is there a deeper layer to the story I missed here of why they broke? Or are they just literally making fun of Cold One Knights as being a bad choice in the game?
I think they. Well, that could be one thing, but I think they mentioned somehow that some war leaders or something for the Cold One Knights were being targeted, and maybe the leadership was removed or something. But yeah, it seems pretty suspect.
Yes, so they break, and the first assault fails, just quite suddenly. And so Malice Darkblade has to behead a bunch of people, get them back in line, and he's like, all right. And so, meanwhile, the High Elves are pulling a 300, and they build a wall of corpses, which is, I think, very, like, you can tell the level of High Elf desperation when High Elves start making corpse walls. I think that really says something about the level of where they're at right now in this fight.
They get their dresses all dirty.
Yeah. So Malice is like, oh, he realizes they're not going to win by cavalry because now there are walls, and everyone knows if you charge cavalry over walls, you're going to fail a bunch of dangerous terrain tests, and those cavalry are going to die. So he's going to have to do this the old-fashioned way and go up with his infantry. So he brings up all his infantry, marches forward, and they have basically like a day-and-a-half long fight. Just on and on and on. And like he can't believe that they can't break these elves. They outnumber 2 to 1. And basically, eventually, after a day and a half, the Dark Elves break again and have to flee back. And so then finally, they're going in for the third assault, and it's not going well because, unbeknownst to them, reinforcements have arrived. Basically, the High Elves have held them off long enough that reinforcements are starting to arrive in the form from Tyrion. And so, like, now the numbers are basically evened out. And they're here at a beachhead, which is not a great position to fight from. And that's when old Zarkan, I guess is how you would say his name, Zarkan, the demon that's inside Malice Darkblade, rears his ugly head. And he basically says, "Hey, buddy, look, why don't you let me out, man? I can take care of you, bro." And Malice is like, "No, I won't give in." And he's like, "Come on, you're gonna lose. Look at all those elves over there. You're gonna lose, and then you're gonna die. And everything you've worked so hard for, it's gonna be gone. But if you let me out, hey, I can win it all for you." So basically, he's like the Hulk in there trying to get out, inside, Malice Banner over here. And Darkblade gives in, lets out the demon, and of course the demon's immediately like, "Well, forget this. I'm not stopping." And just kills everybody around him. He's just killing Dark Elves and High Elves. He's just on an elvish murder spree because, demons love elf souls. So he's just drinking it in. And, he's really honestly not helping. Like, he's not doing everything he could to actually turn the tide. He's just killing a lot of people. And that's when we get to the very unfortunate climax where the Eagle's Gate is truly lost. Because despite the demon showing up, enough elvish reinforcements have arrived that they are probably going to win this. And then all at once they hear this chorus of like roars split the air as they realize the dragons of Calidor have arrived. And they're like, "Oh, thank God, we're fine, we're saved. What could these Dark Elves do against our host of dragons?" And that's when the dragon fire rains down upon them and burns all the High Elves right off of the keep that they were trying to hold. And the Caledorians open the gates of the keep to the Dark Elves, as now we see that Imric had officially decided that the eggs were worth the deal. And the defenders of Eagle's Gate fall. And most of the Dark Elves didn't even realize this was going to be the case. They had no idea. They just suddenly are surprised as they get to wander into their fortress. Tyrionoc's forces retreat back to Tyrion, and the Dark Elves win the day.
So this obviously is a monumental betrayal that's beyond the belief of any High Elf, because they've been at odds with the Dark Elves and the enemies for ages. So this is there's no other way to describe it. Just this is a monumental turnabout. In fact, you kind of ran through that really quickly, the end game of it. But on the walls of the Eagle Gate, when they hear the roar and every dark elf and high elf turns their eyes to the skies to watch it come in, it's the high elves that are cheering about things, and they're all clapping and excited because they got a whole Caledonian contingent coming to burn those dark elves off their shores. But then they turn, as you said, their fire onto the walls and not onto the troops arrayed down below. And that quick realization, it was just an utter breaking of them, and there was no fight left in the high elves at all at that point. They just laid down and gave it up. So there's a couple of aftermath things of this one. Keith, did you have any other thoughts before you go into that?
Well, there's this really, there's one of those little sidebar things as well where there's this young, unbloodied elf, and he's sitting kind of in the bowels of the wall, and him and his friends are manning the portcullis in the gate or something like that. And he's turning around, he hears the dragons, and he's turning around to his elf friend. He's like, I told you they'd come, I told you they'd come. And unfortunately, one of the other elves in there was from Caledor, and he turns around and kills the little guy.
Yep. He says, yep, you're right. They came.
Yep. And
now here's my sword in your throat.
Pretty much, yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so they had some internal agents in there to get it all done.
Yeah. And inexplicably, at the beginning of the third assault as well, I just want to point out that the Dark Elves decided to go back to using knights. They said, okay, first assault, knights didn't work. Second assault, we'll use infantry and hydras. That didn't work. Okay, knights again. Something knights. That's the answer.
And it does make note of the fact that several of them tripped on the walls and died. It actually calls that out, yes. Dangerous terrain, always a thing.
Oh, they rolled a bunch of ones.
Yeah. Rolled a bunch of ones. The other thing is that during the second assault, Malice has kind of this realization that, like, maybe Malekith sent me here knowing that this gate couldn't be broken, and then maybe I would die. And...
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of tidbits of aftermath here, and that is that, as Vince said, Tyrion was coming to the rescue, and then right around the same time, the dragons swooped in and burned down the gate, and the Tyrion guy said, "Oh shit, that didn't go how we wanted it to." So they just they pulled back from their assault, and they said, "Well, no, we can't. Dragons versus chariots, just like on the Warhammer battlefield." Not so good. So they just turned it back around and ran away. There wasn't any pursuit of them because the Dark Elves had to get it all organized, and realizations were coming across the High Elves that were still there in garrison. They had to figure out what to do about themselves. In fact, it does say that Imric, even after that assault, took all of his dragon riders to the foot of the mountain and let the Dark Elves sort themselves out while they just watched from a distance, because they knew that they weren't comfortable intermingling yet, and the Dark Elves probably wouldn't be comfortable intermingling with them either, even though they saved their asses. One other quick thing too, as the battle settled and there was no elf-on-elf fighting anymore, there was still Zarkan raging around in his demonness, hacking away at whatever elf would come into reach. And it's Drusalla that came into. They had encircled him in spears to keep the demon at bay, and Drusalla made her way in there, and she quelled the demon and effectively restored Malice back to himself overnight. And then Malice threw himself at Malekith the next day, giving him the banner to Eagle Gate and saying, "Hey, I did what you asked me to do. I won it for you, buddy. Feel good about me. I'm your man." Without revealing that he had just turned into a demon for several hours and killed hundreds of elves. So that's his little tidbit. Then we have a little sidebar exchange here, and it's actually taken from the perspective of the assassin Shadowblade, who is hanging outside a tower window, listening into an exchange between the new allies of Imric and Malekith and Teclis. So they're having a little bit of a post-game council. And to quickly sum this up, effectively, these guys are talking greater deals now. They're talking about how this is the first stages of the plots that are going to unfold, and they're going to take on the roles of the gods of old. Malik has touched on it already, and he reiterates here again that he has to take up the path of Cain, while Imric introduces that he is to take up the role of Nathu, who is a little bit of a he's a little bit of a trickster god that is a curious god, and he says that he thinks of himself as Nathu because he's opened a door that should not have remained closed. So off he goes into that. He also says, and this is the quote, "Say rather that you have opened the path to the flame," Teclis corrected. But yes, the comparison is otherwise apt. Nethu's actions, though a betrayal, prevented disaster, and so have yours. So he tries to make Imric feel good about things. And then he also says to Malekith, he says, no, your path is not Cain's. You have worn his persona as a cloak, only when it is suited to you. Then who, the Witch King demanded, who else is fit to bear the mantle of the destroyer? And Teclis answers that Cain has not yet come, but it kind of leaves it hanging that somebody else he already has in mind is going to take up the role of Cain as this sort of unfolds. Do you guys have any further comments about how the gods are going to play a part in this, or what your feelings about that exchange?
The other little bit at the end of that exchange is that when Shadowblade gets down off the tower, he encounters Drusas.
Right. Yeah, he has a little bit of talk with her. Tell us about that then.
Oh, I don't think much comes of it. He just kind of meets her, and Shadowblade is typically a servant of Helbron and a devout of Cain. And so, what a presumably disciple of Marathi has to do with him, we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good point. He is usually a minion of Helbron, who she stayed back in her city to slay stuff and bathe in blood. So she didn't actually empty her city to come along on the boat ride to Ulthwan. So what Drusilla says to him is, sort of catches him as he's coming back into another window and says, "I think it's time for your antics to come to an end, sir." And that's where it leaves it. It just kind of leaves it like that. Effectively, her saying, no more going to report back to your mistress. You're here now, and we're going to deal with you here. Okay. Good. Well, so now we have the Dark Elves who are firmly supplanted in Ulthwan by taking on the Eagle Gate. Maybe a quick other note here is that Lokir Fellheart landed a little bit further north, and they came down afterwards to unite with them so they could pass in through the inner mountains. But we gotta take a moment. Maybe we're gonna switch gears back to Tyrion and what he's up to. One of you fellas want to take up from there?
Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Sure. So if we whoosh back to the Phoenix Court and the home of Finnevar, Tyrion is kind of sick of things, and he orders Corhill, who's standing diligently outside of Finnevar's door, to break it down. So Corhill breaks down the door, and they go in, and they find that Finnevar is dead. And he's been dead for quite some time, they suspect, but due to the enchantment of the tower, he's just there in the moment of his death. And apparently he's just covered in these like rent marks of these talons and stuff that have been perfectly preserved in his skin. So then Tyrion pretty much becomes unanimously elected as the next Phoenix King, or at least regent of Ulthwan, because he never goes through the ritual of becoming the Phoenix King, where he steps into the fire and survives. So as regent of Ulthwan, he now decides that Malekith is probably heading towards the Blighted Isles to pick up the Widowmaker and become the embodiment king. So he sets he sets off to try and stop him before he can get to the Blighted Isle. Before that, there's a little throwback to what's happening in Appel Lorraine. If one of you guys want to take that.
Yeah, certainly. Vince, you want that one, or shall I?
I've got it. Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
So we pick up on Naestra and Arahan, right? The two children of Ariel. And if we remember, we've kind of seen now the story from both sides, because the end of that Lilith and Ariel bit at the very beginning of this is the last moment of the other part where Alariel, where they open the door into the tree and say, "Save our mother." And so you hear the end of that conversation at the other point of that one. And so now we pick back up here with Arahan and Naestra basically saying, hey, whoever you are, stop, and there's some mysterious ghostly figure in the woods, and they recognize it as Ladriel, which is another mask of Lilith, and they basically tell her that, hey, we know who you really are. You're the one who poisoned, our mother, and they're none too happy to see this person. And basically they say, she says, are you sure of that? Of course, arriving at the moment where this happens, the roots open up, and a new sort of being, being comes up out of the trees, and that's where we meet the new combined Ariel and Alariel, as basically Lilith says, whom do you see? And what's funny about this is that Naestra and Arahan are twins, one of light, one of dark, right? And each of them, one is the stars, one is the darkness between, and so on and so forth. And so when she asks, who do you see, each of them responds differently, right? Because they each see her through their own eyes. And so that's where we get this, and so basically she is Alariel, but she's also sort of Ariel as well. And that's where we get this character reborn. Basically, she's got Ariel's divine sort of spark, but she's still Alariel. It's not like they just shove the two together. It's more like the essence is within.
Yeah, so again, that's just a little sidebar, again, catching a little bit of the divine nature of this elven saga as it goes on. Okay, so let's return to Tyrion. Now, he's having a little struggle with the politicking going on in Lothern, and having trouble getting out of there with responsibilities to the court, etc., and all the various nobles getting all hoity-toity and telling him about his responsibilities. But it is actually, he's, as you touched on earlier, Keith, he's becoming very chummy with Corhill. Now that Finbar is decidedly dead, and Corhill's allegiance now turns to the Regent and is now the sworn protector of Tyrion. And they get all palsy, and he starts to take more of Corhill's counsel, and they decide together that there's no more sitting around. They have to head off Malekith at the pass, so to speak, because he's on his way to the Blighted Isle to reclaim Widowmaker. And if he does, then that's going to spell terror for the rest of Ulthuan and all the High Elf Society. So off they go across the inner sea, mounting up their fleet, and they make landfall in Illyrian near Elros Bay. And this is at the point where, of course, he's not wrong. Malekith is mounting his host and moving north. But it's the vanguard of Tyrion's Dark Elf force that Malekith's Dark Elf force, that Tyrion first encounters. And this is our pal Malice Darkblade and his demon sword coming together again. So we have when we lay out for this battle, unlike in the previous one that you pointed out, we have an A team and a B team, but the roles are reversed. right? Or at least I
Yes.
get this feeling. Don't you, Vince?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. When you look at the page of this and you've got Tyrion and Corhill on the page for the High Elves, and you start with Talos Dreadbringer, who's he's not nobody, but I mean, come on.
I mean, in the old Dark Elf book, he was a champion upgrade.
Yeah.
Not even a hero. He was just a champion upgrade. So anyway, so I'll pass it to one of you guys if you want to take us through the opening of this little battle. Tell us some key points. Oh, I should say Drusilla is here too again, isn't she?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so is Malice.
And Malice, yeah. Malice and Drusilla, Talaris. Those are the key Dark Elf guys.
Mm-hmm.
So aside from being a big mashy battle, is there any things that stand out for either you, Keith, or Vince in this battle that's remarkable?
Oh, I think there's quite a few key points. So when Tyrion and Coral they look over the ramparts, they find Caradrian and his Phoenix. Phoenix is injured, and Caradrian is bravely trying to fight him off. So if you don't know, Caradrian is a special character. He's head of the Phoenix Guard, essentially. So he's protecting his Phoenix. And Talaris is an executioner for Hardanet, and he has kind of gone against Celebron and decided, no, I'm going to go with Malekith to Ulthuan because he hears Kane. Essentially, Kane is speaking to him and telling him to do things. So as the battle, as Coral and Tyrion see the battle, Tyrion kind of, you see that he gets this descent into madness or bloodlust. So he just takes his silver helms and they charge straight for the enemy. He essentially just tears through like two entire round, like it's not even a problem. But then he kind of gets bogged down, and he immediately attracts the attention of both Talaris and Malekith. So they both kind of make a beeline for Tyrion, and the big swirling melees going around and a big war, and but it really comes down to these kind of key players. So Malice, since Eagle's Gate, he now constantly has the powers of Zarkan active. Like, he's not a big gnarly demon prince anymore, but he is super strong, super fast, all this kind of stuff. So he goes straight for Tyrion. And Tyrion knows he's beat. He can't beat the power of this demon. But then Talaris is also creeping up on Tyrion, because Cain is telling him, like, not as a good shot to lop off that guy's head. But as you mentioned, Kieran, Drusilla is also skulking away in the woods, and she's casting magic, she's disrupting battle lines, and suddenly Corhill and his guys, they're getting teleported into the middle of the Dark Elf regiment, so they're surrounded on all sides. But she sees that Tyrion is at quite a disadvantage, so she kind of has a bit of a gambit. And then there's a series of events that kind of, well, I guess it's not a series of events because it all happens at the same time. So Tyrion gains an advantage over Malice and basically stabs him through the chest. And at the very same time, Talaris punches his giant Drought, the two-handed weapon of the executioners, through Tyrion. And it's at that exact moment, way over on the other side of the world, that the Everchild is killed. And so this resonates. So Tyrion's daughter is killed, and he knows it instantly. And he is filled with this all-consuming rage and hatred. And then he turns around and basically just smashes Talaris to the ground. But with Talaris' dying breath, he says to Tyrion, "You are weak, and you revel in your weakness, and that is what killed your dog." And he doesn't even get to finish the word because Tyrion is lopped off his head. So, who told him to say that? That was exactly Cain's voice. So Cain is using all of his followers and all the little strings that he can into goading Tyrion into becoming Cain, essentially. They're going down this dark path of rage and hate. Kind of like the Sith, actually, if you like. But then again, as I mentioned, Malice is all hopped up on demon juice and is going to lay the smackdown on Tyrion. And then Drusilla does something of quite a gambit and decides to release Zarkan back into Malice. So So Zarkan takes control. He transforms into a giant keeper of secrets again. And Zarkan is just overwhelmed to be back alive and surrounded by elves. He's a demon of Slash as well, so like elf souls are the atheists, and he just starts going berserk. But of course Tyrion is really unhappy now, and he picks up Malice's sword, which is called the Warp Sword of Kane, which is again a big holy relic with regards to Kane, all the Dark Elf lore, which we won't go into. But he essentially takes up these two mighty blades and then rams them into Zarkan and completely finishes them off. And it's at this point that the dead begin to rise.
Yeah, so this is an odd moment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But again, it coincides with, again, we have to remember that this exactly coincides with the ritual that's going on across the other side of the old world in Sylvania. So we have to remember back to the Nagash story again for a second to recognize that once that moment happened on Geheimenschnatt, that all the dead across the whole world rose to their feet and at least just stood there for a little bit. But oddly enough, it was Tyrion that had some kind of affinity to that. And I'm trying to recall if it really gave us a good convincing description of why that is. Vince, did you ever something ring true about that to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is we actually pick up on that moment because remember, so Nagash comes back, all the dead rise as he strips the wind of death out of the vortex, right? And he's got it under his control, and he's ready to like have this army that will literally conquer the world because everywhere there will be the dead. And then he loses his power, and in that moment, the dead are basically, they go back to sort of just like, awaiting orders. And Tyrion, we start the scene from the point of view of Caradhrin, who is just, chopping things and laughing because he's on a phoenix. What does he care? Tyrion holds up the Warp Sword of Kane, and basically he says, like, he yells out with such authority with the Warp Sword of Kane, and he says, "I speak for the Destroyer, right? I bear his blade. You owe him fealty by right of conquest, and your allegiance is mine to command. Kane's enemies are mine, and my enemies are yours. Slay them all." And so, like, by sort of using this sword and calling to this pact into their nature, he then basically takes command, because we have all these undead honestly looking for control in lieu of not being, of Nagash not being potent enough to actually control them at that moment and having to shove the wind of death down into Sylvania. And all of the undead sort of uniformly at once turn and attack the Nagarothi.
This kind of feels like, though, like just an I called it first kind of a moment, right?
Yeah.
Like all these dudes show up, and it's like, I picked that guy for my team, and he's on my team because I called it first, right? I don't know. I just that's my one moment of a little bit of a balderdash moment, I think, here, is that to try to understand why Tyrion, who is nowhere near a magic user or a necromancer or attuned to anything that we would associate with controlling undead minions, for him to have that ability suddenly. A bit weird for me.
Yeah, it was a weird choice, and it's a weird moment to sync up the timeline, like, because really they could have made this timeline sync up at any point they wanted, in this area, right? It didn't have to be that exact moment. So it really was sort of an interesting choice overall, and I will admit, like, when I read this the first time many months back, I was like, wait, what? Because it had been like, a while since I had even read Nagash at that point. I was like, what? Why is this all going on? And it took a minute to sort of put it all together. It does feel a bit jarring, shall we say, like the whole scene as it unfolds. So yeah, I can certainly empathize with that position. I think what they're trying to point at is like the power of Cain and murder and war and blood overtaking the elves, and that gets built up. But still, it's not a choice.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I've got a bit of a conspiracy theory for that one, actually.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, let's go.
If you read the Malice Darkblade books, they're my favorite compendium of any kind of Warhammer novel. 6 books, and if you get a chance, I would definitely recommend picking them up. So at one point, so what happens is Zarkan possesses Malice, and he sets him the task. He's got to collect all these holy relics to get rid of Zarkan and to keep his soul. And one of them is this thing called the Warp Sword of Kane, which is what Malice was wielding and what Tyrion then picks up. And the kind of prophecy behind it is that there's this thing called the Scourge of Kane, or a person called the Scourge of Kane, and when the Scourge of Kane picks up the Warp Sword of Kane, it then heralds the beginning of, I don't know if it's called the Ramadan or the end times, or specifically what the wording is, but essentially it's the war to end all wars. And that's the first time that if Tyrion is in fact the avatar of Kane, or the Scourge of Kane, that's the first time that the prophesied Scourge of Kane had touched the Warp Sword. And then that's what lent him the power in order to command the dead.
So you got to read 6 volumes of Warhammer novel to
pretty much
to catch
in order to make that connection. That's why it's a bit of a wild conspiracy theory, but
I'm glad we had you here to point that out. Now he shatters the Warp Sword, doesn't he? I seem to remember that here.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because there's this little bit of disjoint between the one little box and what happens in the story, because he says he raises this thing and then he shatters, the dead begin to rise, and then it shatters, and then a little bit in the description he talks about hacking down people with 2 swords, and then no more mention is made of the Warp Sword. So there's a little bit of discontinuity there.
Must have been the stub of the sword.
That was it, yeah.
Okay. Well, as we said, so that with the dead on their side, on Tyrion's side anyway, that turns the tides of the battle, and they're able to sweep back the Dark Elves off into the distance. So maybe from here, Keith, take us through a little bit of aftermath of the battle.
Yeah. So the High Elves essentially went mad with the presence of Cain. They were filled with this incredible battle lust and just started routing the Dark Elves, but not the Phoenix Guard. So Cain was able to infect, if you like, all of the regular Dark Elves, or all of the regular High Elves, but the disciples of Asuryan, they were untouched. And then at that point, also Drusilla, she once again changes her visage and follows the High Elves in the pursuit of the Dark Elves.
Yes, so this is a very curious little sidebar. Vince, do you want to talk about this one, or shall I give it a go?
Oh, I'm good too. We're in the tent, I assume, is the sidebar you're pointing to?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Absolutely.
Big reveal. It's an important moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Big moment in the story. So Tyrion is sort of called into this strange, tent with Drusilla, and she calls a meeting, and he, walks up to her and puts his sword up against her throat and is like, speak, witch, or I'll kill you. And she basically calls his bluff and said, if you're going to kill me, you would have done it right when you walked in here, so stop posturing. And he says, that I have something to tell you. And he's like, who are you? Who are you really? And she says, of course you already know me. And Drusilla sort of smiles, and the illusion sort of fades away as he is able to then see the truth of it, and he realizes that Drusilla has been Morathi the whole time, that she never stayed in her tower as Malik hath ordered, but has in fact been marching beside her son and pulling strings the whole time, and now Morathi is in the middle of the High Elf lands and speaking to Tyrion, the new, basically, Phoenix King.
Yeah, so this is a big deal, and for a little bit of elf background, Morathi was married to Anarion back in the day. So Anarion was the first savior of Ulthuan against the incursions of the demons, and Morathi was his consort. Malik, their first son, and so this is sort of, Tyrion has always been propped up as the second coming of Anarion, and that's why there's sort of a kinship between the two here. That's sort of been bubbling under the surface all the time, and although Tyrion had a relationship with Alariel in the past. There's always some sort of crossing of paths here that went on with Marathi, and they have some sort of seated desires with one another, and that's what gets rekindled here at this moment, right in this time. Okay.
Yes, Tyrion definitely has the hots for Marathi, and they play that up quite potently here.
Oh yeah.
And elves are okay with incest.
Well, let's also, just so we didn't lose anybody there. Drusilla shapeshifted herself into an elf, a high elf maiden, to infiltrate the camp in the first place. She didn't walk in that particular guise, right? And then revealed herself to Tyrion once he was in the tent, or when she was in the tent, rather. So Corhill comes back to that and finds out that Tyrion's now got a girlfriend, and thinks that that's a little bit odd, but you know, man just had a raging battle. He's got to satisfy some needs, so I guess we'll let that go. Every good leader needs a concubine, I think, is his thought. And it's his job to just fall in line and let that happen. Right. Now, also following the battle here, ever the late guy to the party, Teclis shows up from wherever that guy's been, and we kind of know that where he's been is doing his double agent dealings on the other side, because Malekith is still behind this vanguard, right? He's with Imric and laying back. So he presents himself to Tyrion, and a lot of things get revealed between these guys. Tyrion calls him out because he now, of course, has recognized that his daughter, the Everchild Aliathra, has been slain by Manfred in that ritual to regain Nagash, and he's felt that. He also, at his side right now, as he confronts Teclis, has Marathi with him. Teclis knows who it is. She's still wearing a little bit of a disguise, so she's not revealed to the High Elves at all as her true self. But they have quite a confrontation, and Tyrion calls Teclis out for his treachery and double dealings. And Tyrion admits to the fact that he engineered Aliathra's position in that great ritual for the sake of, as he says, knowing that she was of tainted blood would not complete the ritual and bring back Nagash to full power, but Nagash has his needs, and it was something that had to be done for the greater plan. Although he says he's sorry, Tyrion doesn't believe that, and is just about to hack him apart, his own brother, when Teclis spins a little bit of magic of his own and uses the Shadow Steed to sweep himself away and avoid the big bad pain that was about to come down. So, having laid all that down, fellas, I think that this is a big meaty chapter, and it's probably worth a little bit of a break at this point to have at least an intermission, although this is still chapter 1 of the Kane books. But maybe before we trail off, I'll give you guys each a last opportunity to give me a moment of truth or a moment of balderdash that really rung true to you so far in this story. Vince, some thoughts?
I don't know if there's like one moment I could call out and call it truth. I think that the balderdash things, other than the ones we pointed out, where I found some of the moments, like we pointed out the thing with the undead, and also the battle with the dark elves and the way that kind of goes down at Eagle's Gate is all a bit. It just felt a bit silly at some points. I suppose I would say. But I think the best moment for me was honestly when the dragons show up and turn on the High Elves that are defending them. It's not that whole scene, because people dying by the thousands, it's hard to actually you don't really feel anything for it because it's told so broadly. But that moment in the tower when the young exuberant elf gets stabbed by his supposed comrade and compatriot, and it's and the other guy's like, yep, they've come and this is what has to be done. That is such a crushing moment, right? because it makes the betrayal personal. And I think that's really a moment of great writing. I really love that part.
Yeah, I agree. Keith, what about your thoughts? What's a big deal for you?
I like Seed of Shadows for the win. You don't hear that often.
Yep. Using the lore attribute, almost.
Oh, just smoke and mirrors away. It's the best. What do I like? I don't think I have one kind of overall moment. Actually, no, one moment that we didn't really touch on. But as Tyrion is sailing across the bay to get to that final battle, he's on a ship with his admiral called Admiral Ashling. He's got this amazing ability where he sings and merworms come out of the ocean and attack the Dark Elves.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We see him a little bit later on in a greater role. But yeah, he's a good little sidebar.
He's got his little siren song for merworms. I like that.
So I'll admit to you, the thing that I struggled with at first was the betrayal of Imric to Malekith, like, and why that happened in the first place. I actually had to go back and reread and understand the significance of the dragon drop-off, the dragon egg drop-off, to really sort of get my head around why millennia of strife would finally just be turned around and how he was talked into the alliance. But I came around, but I had a struggle with it at first, I'll admit.
Actually, can I just add one point to that bit?
Yeah.
There's this really great bit after the battle of those gate with the dragon riders, and Imric notices, and he himself, that the riders themselves aren't doing much, because they're still reluctant to turn on their high elf brothers. And then he kind of reflects to himself that the dragons really didn't seem to have a problem with it, and he kind of says, well, would they really have a problem turning on me? I thought that's quite foreboding. It was a pretty good reflection of where Imric and the Caledonians are at right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, gents, I think we'll take our moment of time there. And for you viewers, we will be back, of course, with more of the end times after these brief messages from our sponsors or some witty thing like that. Okay. Signing off.
A short way ahead, Caradrian saw Tyrion scatter a pair of worm-eaten corpses, Sunfang's blade slicing through the rusting plate of their armor with ease. The regent rose high in Malander's stirrups and lifted the warp sword of Cain aloft, a dark halo of flame blazing about his brow. Then in thunderous tones, the regent spoke the words that had haunted Caradrian's dreams for as long as he could remember.
Dead of Ulthuan,
Shouted Tyrion.
I bear the warp sword of Cain, he who is the destroyer, the murderer of nations, he who made corpses of you all.
At the regent's words, the undead hordes ceased their striving. The rows of silent corpses froze in place and did not move, no matter how Nagarothi's sorceresses shrieked at them.
I speak for the destroyer.
Tyrion continued, his voice echoing like thunder across the plains.
I bear his blade. You owe him fealty by right of conquest. Your allegiance is mine to command. Cain's enemies are mine, and my enemies are yours. Slay them all.
With a piercing crack, the warp sword shattered to ash. Tyrion sank back into Malander's saddle, and his halo turned the color of fresh spilt blood. The regent's words, and whatever magic lay behind them, had found their mark. As one, the dead of eons past turned their backs on the High Elves and marched against the Nagarothi.